Icarus in Dublin, Daedalus in Trieste. Narrative duality in Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It may appear that the last lines of James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man convey the triumphant inception of Stephen Daedalus's budding artistic vocation. In leaving Ireland, it seems that Stephen casts off the shackles that had previously inhibited him from encountering his artistic voice. Stephen's final lines speak volumes about the high-minded goals he hopes to accomplish through his art. Welcome, O life! I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. From this line and the title of the work, it would be fitting to classify Joyce's novel as a classic Bildungsroman, a tale of development, and a Künstlerroman, a novel about an artist. Joyce undercuts both of these traditions with his closing line: Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead. Stephen Daedalus, whose name aligns him with Daedalus the architect, synchronously situates himself in the position of Icarus, whose lofty aspirations brought about his downfall. This dual alignment raises doubt as to whether Stephen's course of action facilitates or impairs his artistic pursuits. Joyce furthers the ambiguity of the final sentence with Stephen's postscript, Dublin 1904, Trieste 1914. Not only is Stephen's future as an artist thrown into doubt, but also his position in space and time. The two terms are not joined by hyphens to indicate spatiotemporal continuity, but are written as discrete entities as though to indicate that Stephen writes his diary entries both from Dublin in 1904 and from Trieste in 1914. In the same words, both realities exist. At what point does Joyce introduce this narrative duality, and to what end? From the beginning of chapter 5, the once linear, unified narrative structure of Portrait splits to form a narrative duality in which Stephen both succeeds in becoming a true artist and falls short. For the sake of time, I must omit my analysis of the unified structure of the first 4 chapters and how they structurally differ from chapter 5. The physics lecture marks the first instance when readers recognize their distance from Stephen as a narrator. Although readers have access to Stephen's thoughts, readers no longer experience Stephen's perceptions as the primary mode through which they encounter the scene. Readers engage with the physics lecture and with Stephen's response to the lecture separately. The scene shifts intermittently between the physics professor's dialogue and Stephen's interior reflections. The physics lecture also marks the first instance in which Stephen's thoughts are not immediate reactions to his external surroundings, but reflective extensions of his perceptions. Duality emerges in the physics lecture when the reader recognizes his or her perception as distinct from Stephen's own, thus creating space for narrative ambiguity. Due to the narrative ambiguity, readers can interpret Stephen's musings as an integrative extension of the physics lecture or as a daydream disconnected from Stephen's lived reality. Stephen's awareness, or lack thereof, during the physics lecture indicates his capacity to engage the world as an artist. The physics lecture is brief and largely overlooked by critics in favor of more dramatic sequences such as the Sermon on Hell or Stephen's rapturous bird girl epiphany. During the physics episode, Stephen sits in lecture as his physics professor drones about a number of topics, none of which appear to immediately pertain to the narrative. Stephen seems to not pay attention to what his professor is saying. The narrative shifts back and forth between the professor's dialogue and Stephen's thoughts. The scene ends as abruptly as it began and is never alluded to again in the rest of the novel. Joyce delivers the physics lecture in disconnected fragments, making it impossible for readers to track the continuity of the lecture. The reader experiences a scene from both within and beyond the perspective of Stephen. Unlike previous instances in the narrative, when Stephen's inner thoughts provided a more detailed image of external reality, Stephen's thoughts in the physics scene remove readers from the immediate external reality of the classroom and render a disjointed, unintelligible impression of the lecture. How does Joyce convey this sense of fragmentation to the reader? During the physics scene, Stephen diligently writes an unspecified formula related to force and velocity in his notes. The professor's words come across as a non sequitur when he remarks, "So we must distinguish between the elliptical and the ellipsoidal." Just as the content of the lecture appears disjointed and fragmented, so too does the professor's syntax when he opens a sentence with the word "so." A rude comment from Moynihan cuts the professor short and prompts another lengthy daydream for Stephen. The professor reemerges into the narrative frame, only to begin expounding upon what appears to be an entirely new subject. The wires in modern coils are of a compound called platinoids discovered by F.W. Martino. This remark segues into an explanation of how platinoid coils convey current. The last time the reader hears from the professor, he is ruminating upon the distinction between pure science and applied science. Robinson, the only critic to evaluate the physics lecture in detail, claims that such a wide variety of topics could not possibly be covered in a single lecture. He goes on to criticize Stephen's complacency during the physics lecture and that Stephen does not seem to notice the absurdity of the lecture. Robinson argues at length, "The scene is a wild parody of reality, not an imitation of it. Its effect should evidently derive from the gap between the surreal subject matter and the matter-of-fact response of the students, perhaps as a counter to Stephen's growing power as a determiner of meanings." Robinson makes a valuable insight that Stephen's response to the physics lecture may bode poorly for his future as an artist. However, by neglecting to evaluate the content of Stephen's daydreams and focusing exclusively on the professor's dialogue, Robinson bases his argument on weak premises. Because Robinson only assesses excerpts of the complete scene, he does not evaluate the scene narratively. Stephen does not note the incongruity of the lecture because the lecture itself is not incongruous. The reader perceives a fragmented form of the physics lecture that differs from Stephen's perception of the lecture because the lecture continues beyond the narrative frame while the reader participates in Stephen's daydreams. To address Robinson's point regarding the variety of topics in the lecture, the topics only appear varied because the reader does not have access to any connectives that link the points together. The concepts that the physics professor explores are not necessarily disjointed. The professor covers two topics in his lecture, the issue of regularity and the principles of resistance. Does Stephen engage with these topics in his daydreams, and if so, to what extent? Contrary to Robinson's thesis, Stephen does appear to engage with the physics lecture. The narrator remarks, "The spectre-like symbols of force and velocity fascinated and jaded Stephen's mind." Stephen muses. He had heard some say that the old professor was an atheist Freemason. Oh, the great old day! It seemed a limbo of painless, patient consciousness through which souls of mathematicians might wander, projecting long, slender fabrics from plane to plane of ever rarer and paler twilight, radiating swift eddies to the last verges of a universe ever vaster, farther, and more impalpable. Stephen's thinking ventures outward from the formula on the page before him to his professor and onward to the souls of mathematicians projecting upon the universe. Stephen's image of these mathematicians is a poetic imagining of the principle of recursion. Recursion is the determination of a succession of elements by operation of one or more preceding elements. In simpler terms, recursion is the progress of expansion by means of self-reflection found throughout nature, in structures such as trees, river deltas, and eddies. Expansion by means of self-reflection is the most efficient way for a force to move against resistance. Just as recursive sequences radiate ever outward against resistance by means of self-reflection, so too do the mathematicians radiate outward swift eddies against the resistance of a two-dimensional limbo of painless patient consciousness. The professor reemerges in the narrative and begins to lecture on the distinction between the elliptical and the ellipsoidal. An ellipse is a regular two-dimensional shape, and an ellipsoid is an irregular three-dimensional analog of an ellipse. As two-dimensional structures, ellipses cannot be found in nature and only exist theoretically, as opposed to ellipsoids, which actually exist. What is Joyce conveying about the relationship between actuality and regularity? Perhaps Stephen's next daydream can illuminate how this allusion to geometry fits within the narrative. Stephen imagines priestly administrators and lay academics of Trinity College ambling and stumbling, tumbling and capering, kilting their gowns for leapfrog, holding one another back, shaken with deep, thick, fast laughter, smacking one another behind, and laughing at their rude malice, calling to one another by familiar nicknames, protesting with sudden dignity at some rough usage, whispering two and two behind their hands. Roughhousing like schoolboys, Stephen's formators are enthralled with each other with no apparent concern beyond engaging in amusing themselves. Stephen's surreal image of his formators indicates Stephen's growing disillusionment with the community of Trinity College. Both the priest and the academic represent two respectable vocational paths for Stephen that his time at Trinity College is supposed to enable him to pursue. The priests and professors' play is regressive. Despite their energetic activity, they are stagnant because they do not act in accordance with their vocations. Both the priest and the academic give of themselves for the betterment of individuals and the communities they serve, yet the priests and professors of Stephen's daydream are entirely caught up within themselves. It may be for Stephen that the true practice of these two reputable vocations is only a matter of theory. These figures are precisely that. Figures, no more developed or enlightened than the students that they are supposed to form. Joyce portrays Stephen's formators, the professors of Trinity College, and by extension, the Irish Catholic culture that informed Stephen's upbringing, as generating a form of resistance that restricts the individual from fully becoming. Mulrooney adopts a Joycean view of Irish culture when he describes, "Most Irish chose not to admit any relativity in their cultural situation, and instead embraced the security of simplistic notions of what it means to be Irish. What anglicized Celticism was for the Irish intelligentsia, Catholicism was for the mass of unschooled Irishmen, an essentialized collective identity, complete with its own way of perceiving and speaking about and living in the world." For Joyce, to accept the simplistic notion of what it means to be Irish means to adopt a painless, patient consciousness of one's place within the family, the nation, and the world. Joyce condemns the notion that one's identity stems primarily from one's relationships within a given community, as opposed to deriving from qualities innate to the individual. This reductive image of the human person is the painless, patient consciousness that the mathematicians resisted in Stephen's first daydream. Condemning the yielding response of the Irish literary theatre to public pressure, Joyce himself wrote during his college years, "Until the artist has freed himself from mean influences about him, no man is an artist at all." It seems that for Stephen, in order to develop into a true artist and achieve the fullness of being that he desires, he must break from the path set before him at Trinity College and live an irregular life. Immediately following the physics lecture, Stephen leaves Trinity College for the last time. If one considers the physics lecture scene in light of the complete narrative, one recognizes that the entire novel has a recursive, self-reflecting structure. Joyce's epic, Finnegan's Wake, is reputed by many to follow a strict recursive structure, and it seems that Portrait unfolds similarly. Kenner wrote that the triumphant ending of each chapter turns in on itself and creates the abysmal opening of the following chapter. He was right in observing that the action of each chapter of Portrait is the same action. Until chapter 5, each chapter of Portrait progresses forward according to a pattern of composition and disintegration. In this way, the narrative structure is not rectilinear, but coiled. Coils are recursive structures because they grow outward by means of the same ratio for every 90-degree rotation. The coils in the physics lecture provide electrical resistance. The coiling narrative framework lends itself to the notion that everything around Stephen generates resistance that impedes him from developing as an individual. For the first 4 chapters of the novel, the reader experiences the narrative through Stephen's stream of consciousness, yet there is nothing within Stephen himself to contextualize and give meaning to his and the reader's experience. Both the reader and Stephen are passively moved by their impressions. If Stephen does not resist, he will inevitably adopt the painless patient consciousness of his community. The final chapter of the novel opens a few years after Stephen's bird girl epiphany, when Stephen realizes that his love for beauty should not be a source of shame. He resolves to pursue the beautiful with his whole being and no longer allow his family, his national identity, or his religious beliefs to constrain him. Stephen pursues beauty, and in so doing, progresses as an individual by means of self-reflection. The physics lecture marks the first instance that Joyce grants the reader the narrative distance from Stephen to recognize him as an active agent, and that Stephen has been operating as an independent agent without the reader's conscious knowledge since the beginning of Chapter 5. Although readers continue to have access to Stephen's thoughts, they no longer experience the narrative exclusively from Stephen's perspective. Just as the reader is now free from Stephen's perspective, so too is Stephen free from the reader and able to develop as an active agent apart from the reader. With Stephen free from the limitations imposed upon him by family, nation, faith, and the reader, the self-reflecting, coiling structure of the narrative gives way to another new recursive structure, a fork. Given the recursive structure of the narrative, it is not possible for Stephen to progress within the unified framework of the first 4 chapters. Due to the mounting resistance around Stephen, the narrative must split, thus forming a duality in which Stephen both succeeds and fails to become the artist he aspires to be. It may be that the means by which Stephen pursues the beautiful will facilitate his artistic vocation. Stephen's imaginative musings during the physics lecture reveal that Stephen is no longer passively affected by his sensory impressions, but appears to exhibit mastery over them. In Stephen's final lines, Joyce presents the vocation of the artist as one who actively participates in one's environment and allows oneself to be moved by sensory impressions so as to represent them for others in a more humane way. Just as artists translate their experiences in order to lend depth and intelligibility to their own environments, so too does Stephen build from the concepts of the physics lecture and translate them poetically, thus lending them greater meaning within the context of the whole narrative. One could read Stephen's decision to leave Trinity College as Stephen's way of asserting mastery over himself and pursuing the reality of experience by means of self-reflection. Having developed the ability to engage the world as an active agent and discern meaning from his sensory impressions, it seems that Stephen has successfully resisted the mean influences about him, freeing himself to pursue art. Hence it follows that Stephen writes the second half of Chapter 5 from Trieste in 1914 as a budding artist. On the other hand, it may be that Stephen remains in Ireland. Despite his poetic gloss in the physics lecture, it is unclear that Stephen recognizes what he is doing as artistic. Since the reader is removed from Stephen, it is possible for the narrative to extend beyond Stephen's understanding. Stephen may not recognize his imaginings as connected to the lecture. Furthermore, Stephen may not recognize himself in relation to his daydreams, perhaps daydreaming as a means to escape his external reality rather than encounter it. Stephen may consider the beautiful and the reality of experience to be something beyond ordinary life. If Stephen is unable to apprehend the beautiful in the quotidian, and himself in relation to the ordinary, he cannot become an artist. He will continue to pursue an unreachable concept of beauty that lies beyond a lived reality that he can never transcend. Like Icarus, Stephen will destroy himself. Due to the reader's narrative distance from Stephen, the reader cannot ascertain Stephen's engagement with the world around him and whether the means by which he pursues beauty will enable him to become an artist. Joyce does not intend for the reader to resolve this duality. Everything that follows the physics scene can be understood to be leading to Stephen's liberation or to his destruction. The recursive structure of the narrative indicates that the only way forward is through self-reflection. It is not the reader's role to declare whether or not Stephen will become an artist, because the reader is not Stephen. Having developed into an active agent, only Stephen can build his future. Whether he succeeds or fails to become an artist he does so by his own actions.